Oh, just a tremendously fun-loving fellow. You know, I mean, he raced purely for fun, and in many ways, you know, I think I got as much fun out of it as he did. And I always remember one photograph of he and Peter Collins were like a pair of rather irresponsible schoolboys. And after one of the practice sessions at Nürburgring for the German Grand Prix, obviously Peter had said something, you know, made some funny, and there was a girl with them, as there always was, at least one, and Mike had stopped, you know, and he used to wear these bloody awful old shoes, and he'd got his cap on and his old sports jacket, and he just stopped in his tracks, and his head was back, and he was roaring with laughter. And
a very flash sort of guy, you know, I mean, a great character, a man who was a lot of fun. I mean, I got along very well with Mike, but Mike and I both realised it was important for both of us to have this thing where people sort of, you were either a Hawthorn fan or a Moss fan, you couldn't really be both. And this was, of course, to both of us was a great benefit because it gave the two sides. You could either be, this, as I was, fairly serious, took thing, you know, you know, didn't drink much, chased the girls, but not as much as he did. And he was, on the other hand, was the beer drinking sort of guy, come on, you know, swashbuckling type, and therefore it covered the whole gamut of people, and therefore it was far better that they would build up a great rivalry between us. And we did have a rivalry, obviously. I mean, Mike was an extremely competent driver and one of the people that I wanted to beat. And I suppose he probably felt the same. But that didn't mean that one couldn't be friends. And we did get along pretty well.
Mike was a handful, don't make any mistake. Mike could get very rough. Two different Mike Hawthorns. The Mike Hawthorn I knew from motor racing, very serious. On the circuit, not in the pits, but on the circuit, he knew his business and he was a very serious racing driver. A lot of people didn't appreciate that. He was. Socially, he was a bit of a handful. You could have some wonderful parties with Mike, but more often than not, they tend to get out of hand.
Grouse are more fortunate than racing drivers because their close season lasts so much longer. Looking up my diary, I see that my last race in 1957 was the Venezuelan Grand Prix for sports cars on November 3rd, and the first event, as far as I was concerned, of the 1958 season was the Argentine Grand Prix, first round in the World Championship on January 19. 9 weeks or so is not a lot of time between the end of one season and the start of another. However, it was an interval with bags of drama. First of all, the Maserati factory announced their retirement from international racing. This decision was forced upon them for financial considerations, but obviously the limitation of sports car championship races to 3 litres had something to do with it. They had put a lot of work and even more hope into their 4.5 litre car. Certainly the Maserati decision served to underline the high cost of motor racing, which even Fangio's World Championship victory at the wheel of a Maserati failed to offset. At the beginning of the 1958 season, the CSI, the controlling body of international motorsport, decreed the use of aviation spirit in place of the dope fuel of the previous years. The opposition in the Argentine did not frighten us. Van Wall and BRM were not there, of course, and Fangio was to drive one of the ex-works Maseratis, converted to run on petrol. Bera, Shell, Godier and Gould were also entered on Maseratis, and Stirling Moss had Rob Walker's little 1.9-litre Cooper Climax, renamed Sputnik 3 by the local press. This made up a field of 10 cars, including our 3 Dinos. Pete and Musso drove the Casablanca cars, and I had a new car with experimental brakes and an aero screen, which I prefer to the normal wraparound Perspex job. In the end, Stirling made it with 2.7 seconds to spare from Musso, and I crossed the line 10 seconds later to finish third.
It was, of course, the first time, I think, that a rear-engine car had competed in the World Championship event. And the others, because it looked so small and not really competitive alongside a Ferrari and so on, I think that we were taken a little bit as a joke until we went out and sort of practiced and showed the thing really had got quite a lot of performance. And it was particularly easy to drive, and therefore you could overdrive it. Well, Tony van der Velde gave me permission, because I was driving for him, to race for Rob Walker, who I'd met. And I knew Rob had, well-produced cars, or well-maintained, and I asked him, what about Argentina? And they paid quite well, and it was arranged that I'd drive his Cooper, just like this one, with, I think, a 2.2-litre engine, because the engines, the Climax engine, they had a Climax engine, they were gradually being enlarged, and at that time had not reached 2.5 litres, so we had a 2.2. It was a very twisty circuit, and I remember one of the biggest problems we had was tyre wear. We were very concerned about it. And of course, on these cars, you could never do a quick change, because they were, nut and bolt virtually, the way the wheels were held on. And this was one big concern we had.
Of all the races that count for the World Championship, the Grand Prix of Monaco provides the most luxuriant setting. It is run round houses over the twisting roads of Monte Carlo. The 1.9-mile circuit seems to be an unending series of twists and turns. There are no straights. From the start on the quayside, the circuit doubles back on itself after the gasometer turn, goes right at Saint-Devote and up the hill to the Casino Square, then plunges downhill with a right and left turn past the railway station. Right and right again to the front and the tunnel, along the promenade, and a left-hand turn completed the circuit. Pete and Louise had flown straight back from Sicily to Monaco, where they were living on their yacht, and I wired them to meet me at Nice airport. I had hoped to fly my Vega Gull down, but the weather reports were bad, and I took the normal airline service. Louise was waiting for me in their little Vespa, a wonderful little motor car. Louise let me drive it back to Monte Carlo. We had enormous fun throwing it round the corners. It's only a little two-stroke 400cc engine, and nearly everything passed us on the hilly parts. But when we got to the run down into the town, it screamed round all the corners, and we passed everyone who had overtaken us on the way up, much to their annoyance. The Monaco event was round 2 for the championship, and it was to be our first meeting with the van wall, which gave the race an added interest. Basically, the van wall remained unchanged as to the mechanical components, but the pistons and compression ratio had been adapted to meet the problems of running on aviation fuel, and the exhaust system had been completely redesigned. They had a blunter appearance too, as the long nose had been cut off and was replaced by a squat nose with a protective bar in front, the better to cope with the inevitable shunting match on the gasometer turn, first time round. They were also using a new type of wheel, similar to those that Colin Chapman uses on the Lotus. Cast in magnesium alloy, it saves a lot of weight over the normal alloy-rimmed wire wheel. These were fitted with a knock-on hub at the back, but were bolted on at the front. Lewis Evans' car remained on wire wheels to provide a comparison between the two types, but these too were eventually changed for the new type. I don't think the drivers liked them very much. There didn't seem to be any give in them, and they experimented all through the season with them, eventually reaching a compromise at Casablanca by fitting the normal wire wheels in front and the alloy jobs at the rear. Ferrari had 4 cars also, 3 of them using the 1957 space frame, while the 4th had the newer, smaller diameter tubing for the main framework. And this latter car had a 2-litre V6 engine, although we had a spare 246 engine for the 3 main cars in case we broke one during training. Training for Monaco is always a serious business, as only 16 cars can start, and the entry was no less than 25. Qualification was therefore by practice time, and with 14 factory cars entered, the private owners did not stand much of a chance. By private owners, I do not mean Rob Walker and his Coopers, which had surprised us in the Argentine. I counted these in among the 11 British cars that constituted the challenge to our 4 Ferraris. An extra incentive to take the training period seriously was the £100 prize for the fastest lap during each of the training periods. The first of these was on Thursday afternoon at 3 p.m, and there was a good deal of activity as everyone went out to size up the circuit. However well a driver may know a circuit, he has always got to learn it again with a new car.
Yeah, no, this certainly was not the best car for Monty. I seem to remember we chopped the nose off and made it as short as we could because it's a fairly big car, but it was responsive and that sort of thing. But because of the flat spot, that at a place like Monaco, of course, became worse than it would on many other circuits. But it was quick, but not the easiest car on a tight type of circuit like that.
Behra on the BRM got things really moving with a lap of 1 minute 40.8 seconds, nearly 2 seconds faster than Fangio's record lap with the Mercedes in 1955. The Coopers were all going very well, and Brabham did a 1 minute 42.5 seconds, and although Stirling was not too happy with his van wheel as far as brakes and steering were concerned, Tony Brooks on his van wheel tied with Behra to share the £100 for fastest lap. The best that I could do with the Ferrari was 1 minute 42.9 seconds, and Pete and Taffy could do no better than 1 minute 45, with Musso 2/5 slower than them. The second session started at 5:45 a.m. on Friday morning, a convenient time if you happen to want to watch practice on your way home from one of Monte Carlo's nightclubs, and good too for the cars, in that both the air and the circuit were cooler. Even at that hour, Monte Carlo looks lovely. The yachts lined up in the harbour, the water lapping their sides, the white terraces of houses rising one above another to the mountains behind, interspersed with palm trees and that pink flower whose name I can neither spell nor remember. If you add the sight and sound of racing cars roaring through the streets, you have a picture that gladdens the heart of the British motor racing enthusiast. The BRM equipe did not get up early in view of their satisfactory showing of the day before, but everyone else was out. Overnight, Tavoni had arranged the changing of gear ratios, which were too high, and my Perspex screen was replaced by the aero screen that I prefer. In addition, Perspex hardtops had been fitted over the protruding air intakes. I was able to knock a second off my time. The 2 Lotus, driven by Allison and Hill, had qualified safely, if not without various troubles. They were both 1957 Formula 2 cars, but were fitted with the 1960cc Coventry Climax engine. Only 2 independents qualified, Bonnier and Scarlatti, both of whom drove Maseratis. Scarlatti's car was the later of the 2, but there was nothing between them as to time. Another sign of the times was that 10 of the 16 starters were stopped by discs only. The Italian cars in the race were still beating the old-fashioned drum. Sunday was race day, and once again the weather was beautiful and a hot sun beat down from a cloudless sky of blue upon the pageantry below. Monaco is a peaceful principality, but its army is at least dressed to kill and adds its own inimitable touch to the proceedings. Prince Rainier and Princess Grace arrived and drove round in a vast American car, and I remember wondering if it understeered as much as the Ferrari, if indeed it steered at all. All was set for round 2 of the World Championship. A silence one could almost hear settled on the crowd, as it does before the start of every race. and then engines burst into life, snapping, crackling and popping like a television commercial for a breakfast food. Engine notes rose with a flag, then down it came and we were away. At the end of lap 1, I was 7th, behind Bearer, Brooks, Brabham, Moss, Trantignon and Lewis Evans. With the Ferrari going so well, I thought I had better get a move on and stay as close to the leaders as I could. I managed to get past Lewis Evans and Trantignon, which took me up to 5th place. I noticed Salvadori had gone into his pit first time round. Then, at about 5 laps, I caught up Stirling, who was then lying 3rd, and he waved me past just before we got to the tunnel. Meantime, Bearer and Brooks were quite a way in front, but I caught up with Tony and for several laps tried hard to pass him. I had the edge on acceleration and speed, but not quite enough to take him on the straight bits, and of course into the corners it was too narrow to get past. I was getting quite annoyed, but the fact was that he couldn't see properly out of his mirror. I'd noticed that the van wall mirrors were not all that good, and I knew that our own were no good at all. Tony is very good about moving over if someone wants to go through, but although he knew I was there, he didn't realize that I was trying to overtake him. After a while, he did let me go through, and off I went after Bearer. It must have been just after this that Tony packed up. Bearer was still in the lead at quarter distance, 25 laps. I was 2nd, and Stirling, the sole remaining van wall, was 3rd. Pete, Musso and Taffy Trips were all still in the race. Then, just as I caught Bearer, he suddenly slowed. It turned out that he had brake trouble. This let me into the lead, and I was really enjoying myself. Bearer was now out, but Stirling began to close up on me, and at 30 laps he was just 2 seconds behind. 2 laps later, I waved him past in the same place as he had waved me, but I tucked in behind him. And so we went on for 5 laps, during which Stirling broke the lap record of 1 minute 40.7 seconds, and I took it back on the next lap at 1 minute 40.6. where it stayed for the rest of the race. We were having a wonderful race, but then about lap 37, as we left the tunnel, I suddenly saw smoke coming out of the van wall exhaust, and Stirling drove slowly into the pits. They found that a cam follower had fractured, and the last van wall was out. At this stage, things looked good for Ferrari, and only Trantignon in the 2nd place spoiled a Ferrari 1, 2, 3, 4. I had about 13 seconds on him, and I found I could hold him there quite easily. So I decided to leave it, and perhaps work it up nearer the end without pressing the car unduly. It was still going beautifully, and the understeer was either better or I was becoming used to it. Then, as so often happens when I think I'm all set for a win, something happened. Going down past the station on lap 46, I put my foot down and the engine missed. Then it picked up again. As I turned onto the front to go towards the tunnel, I put my foot down, and this time it cut out altogether. It spluttered once or twice, and then just packed up. I walked slowly back to the pits, and walking past the hotel near the station, I looked up into one of the rooms, and a lovely blonde girl looked out. I stopped and asked if she had a glass of water, not the most original of remarks, but one that lovely blondes, whose answer to most questions is no, could hardly refuse. She asked me to come in, and as I climbed in through the window, I was caught by an autosport photographer. But even he did not realize there was a blonde inside. I had my glass of water, several of them, and then returned to the pits in a much better temper.
One of the greatest circuits ever anyway, but the fact that the public are so close to you and you're sort of playing to the crowd is very nice, and the fact that I remember quite well going down towards the station, there was Oscar's bar on the left and a very pretty girl. Then we used to blow kisses at her every lap, and I'm sure that Mike probably found this one with a glass of water somewhere else. And if you did break down, the people there would obviously ask you in and give you refreshments. And I should think Michael went in there and probably chatted her up as well, actually. Yes.
I stood at the gasworks urging on Luigi and Pete, who are now second and third respectively. With 60 laps gone, Luigi needed to pick up a second per lap, but they could do nothing about it. And so the little French driver Trintignant took the flame to give private owner Walker his second major Grand Prix with the little Cooper, just as in 1955 he had scored an unexpected win for Ferrari over the Mercs. Musso and Pete followed him over the line and thought themselves very lucky to finish so high up. They complained bitterly about their cars. The engines were very bad and had a rough period when all the power seemed to disappear. However, Luigi's second place put him in the lead for the championship with 12 points, as he had also finished second in the Argentine. This small crumb of comfort served to offset the second win of the astonishing little Cooper, a car costing only about a quarter of the price of a normal Grand Prix car.
Well, Morris was a very good, consistent, steady driver. Not the fastest, not the flashiest, but a very good, precise driver. And of course, at Monaco, this matters. And also at Monaco, I think it particularly suits the style of those small rear-engine cars, as was proven time and again. I think that Morris was a man who would start out very consistently and keep the same sort of lap time and just keep wearing away at everybody else. And I think that because of that, he was, able to come through and win the race.
Zandvoort was a funny circuit in that there were a succession of curves on the back of the circuit, and unless you had the car handling absolutely right, it was extremely difficult to make these sudden changes in direction, because the car was first drifting to the left, and then drifting to the right, and then drifting to the left. And the Van Wall was a great car, but it wasn't one that enjoyed being thrown around. The 250F Maserati was a motor car that lent itself to being thrown around. You could throw it into drifts, out of drifts, you could power slide it out of corners. The Van Wall wasn't that sort of motor car. It preferred to be cornered more closely to the geometrical line. You certainly had a drift, but it used to slightly understeer and was not particularly forgiving. It really went quickly, but not in a way that you felt able to take liberties with it. So I found difficulty getting my car set up properly for Zandvoort.
Moss and the one remaining Van Wall stayed safely out in front. I finished fifth, so our chances, which had looked so good at the start of the season, were just being thrown away. The Spa-Francorchamps circuit, which was first raced over in 1921, has changed considerably over the years. Once it was a slow, tricky circuit. Now it is a fast, tricky circuit. For many years there has been considerable competition as to which is the fastest road course in Europe, with the Reims-Gurs circuit and Spa-Francorchamps as main contenders for the title. In their enthusiasm, those responsible for these two circuits have turned them from roads to tracks. And Spa, the faster of the two, consists mainly of wide sweeping bends which can be taken at anything up to 150 miles an hour. The pits are on a slope which drops quite steeply to the left over Les Rouges before it climbs through a fastish right-hand corner to a long left-hand bend which runs to Bernenville and then dips to Malmedy. There it goes right and right again before the run along to Stavelot. Then comes another slow right-hand swerve as one still climbs. Then along the 3 or 4 mile section, still sweeping right and left, to the hairpin at La Source, which brings you down to about 30 miles an hour, and the pits again. A total length of 8.75 miles. We were soon out on Thursday evening, as we were all anxious to see how the cars would handle. I did a few laps and came in to say how much better it was. I went out again and met Stirling on the van wall, so I've changed my mind about doing some fast laps. Stirling obviously thought the same. He wasn't going to show me how fast the van wall would go, not on the first evening out at any rate. When I came in, I found that Brooks had set up the best time with a 4 minutes 6 seconds, and I was a little slower. I went to Tavoni and explained that as Moss was out on the circuit, I had not been trying too hard, and I was sure that I could get below Tony's time. They gave me the car again. It was handling remarkably well, and obviously had plenty of go. Out I went and did 3 laps, one of which was 4 minutes 0.6 seconds, the fastest time of the day. I was very happy with this because I felt sure that I could go even quicker than that. The Friday evening session was most exciting for everyone but me. I had thought my axle ratio was a little low and had asked Tavoni if I could have a higher one so I could knock a second or two from my time. But what I gained on the return run from Stavelot, I was losing on the outward section. Stirling, who had done no better than 4 minutes 4.8 seconds on Thursday, knocked this time sideways, and mine as well, with a lap at 3 minutes 57.6 seconds, an average of 132.75 miles an hour. The race was, it seemed, to be a Ferrari van wall party, as the BRMs were not showing good form, and the Coopers and the Lotus were finding that Spa was not ideally suited to such small machinery. The rest of the field, mainly independent Maseratis, were not exactly hanging about with lap speeds of 110. Meantime, I had the original axle ratio back, and after a few laps to get my eye in, I managed a 3 minutes 57.1 to pip Stirling for the pole position on the grid. People were saying that the Ferrari looked by far the most stable car on the circuit, and with our speed, things looked good. When Gendebien, with the 4th car and its new coat of yellow paint, the Belgian racing colour, also beat the 4 minutes, we were really pleased. This gave us 2 cars on the front row of the grid. Each year, one of the Grandes Épreuves is accorded the title of the Grand Prix of Europe, and this year the honour had fallen to the Belgian Grand Prix. It was, therefore, just one of those things that the premier race of the year was a prime example of the haphazardry that accompanies the organisation of the sport. The regulations called for an event of 2 hours duration, or 300 kilometres in length, and although 24 laps of Spa is in fact 339 kilometres, it was only 1 hour 37 minutes of motor racing. The organising club must have had their own doubts too, because the programme printed 30 laps as the duration of the race. What might have been the result had it been run over that distance is anyone's guess. With such a short race, the customer was given his value in other goods. There was a parade of vintage Bugattis from the Bugatti Owners Club of Holland, en route for Le Mans, a clever advertising stunt in which some Volkswagen toured the circuit in tight formation and painted in the Belgian colours, and a handicap race for sports, grand touring and production cars. Finally, before the start at 4 p.m, there was a parade of drivers, each one being driven round the circuit in convoy in an open car with his name on a board in front. You just sat there and waved at the crowd as you drove by. I was hoping I'd get a Jag, but I drew a Mercedes, as also did Stirling. Pete drew a Sprite. Once that was over, and the ex-King Leopold had arrived with his wife, the Princess de Rhéthy, all was set for the start. I had got pole position, and they had put me on the left-hand side of the grid with Luigi in the middle and Stirling on the right. But the start was on a slope down to the first corner, a left-hander, so the best or pole position was obviously on the right-hand side, so that one could get a good sweep into the first corner. My position didn't seem very fair, and I pointed out that as the fastest I should have the best place. They said that I had got it. I argued the point, and then they agreed to swap Stirling's and my car round. Not that it was to matter very much, as I made a bad start anyway. The sun was really hot by then, and the starter put up the 2-minute signal. So just before the 1-minute signal, we started up, which gave just long enough to get the right temperature when the flag falls. The 30 seconds to go went up, and then for some reason the 2-minute ball went up. At long last the flag fell, and with one eye on my temperature, which was now off the clock, I made a nonsense of my getaway. So did Musa, and it was Moss who led, with Brooks behind him as we streaked down through Eau Rouge and up the rise to the right-hander. Gendebien was the first Ferrari, then Berra on the BRM, and I was behind with Peter not far away. We were still in a bunch with Stirling in the lead when he missed a gear at Stavelot, and the revs rose, a valve touched, and that was that. The van wall just trickled back to the pits and retired.
This engine was not the most forgiving. In other words, it had a fairly narrow band, but more important than that, you would not, you should not, and you could not over-rev. And I remember going, I think, from 4th to 5th, and it didn't quite go in because the gearbox wasn't that easy. It didn't quite go in. I thought it was in, let off the clutch and put my foot, of course, flat down again, and it buzzed it. And I don't know what I went to, but obviously over the maximum res we were allowed, and it touched the valves, and that was it, and I was out. Quite entirely my fault. It is. In my whole racing career, I've made a few mistakes, but this, I suppose, was probably my most glaring mistake, and I came in and I apologized for it, and that was it, nothing else I could do. You know.
On the second lap, Pete took Tony, and I nipped in ahead of Gendebien, while Musa had gone ahead of Berra and Lewis Evans. Third time round, Tony had gone ahead of Pete and was really having a go, but I noticed that his car was beginning to smoke a little. It was obviously getting worse. By 4 laps he had dropped right back, and Tony was going away from him. Then, on the 5th lap, Pete waved me past, and I set off in pursuit of Tony. Tony had a lead of 41 seconds, and there were only 10 laps to go. Obviously, there wasn't a great deal I could do. It must have been about this time that just as I was about to lap Graham Hill on the Lotus, he blew up in a cloud of smoke, leaving a telltale line of oil on the circuit. It could have been very nasty for him bursting it there, as he could so easily have spun off. However, he kept it under control and pulled off course. Very few cars were left now of the 19 starters, and the Spa circuit was quite deserted. I thought that if I could not catch Tony, I must make the fastest lap, and I got this at 3 minutes 59.3 seconds, and was pulling back quite a few seconds on Tony. Then David York speeded Tony up, and although most of the reports said that he did not regain fastest lap, the Ferrari pits thought so, and hung out a sign to say so. Perhaps this was just to keep me going quickly. It was on the last lap, so I just had to go. I put everything I got into it, and I knew that it was going to be a very fast one. I thumped it through Stavelot pretty quickly, and then coming up to the hairpin just before the pit, I lost it for a fraction of a second, and it went sideways. Hell, I thought, I've ruined it now. I've lost the fastest lap, I won't get it. I got round and accelerated down to the finishing line, and I suppose I was about 150 yards from the line when there was a loud and all too familiar crash as the engine blew up in a very big way. I slipped it into neutral and coasted over the line with a tremendous plume of white smoke pouring from the exhaust. I did not even bother to think about the fastest lap then. It was obvious I had had it, for clouds of white smoke from a racing car does not denote a happy event, as it does in Vatican circles in Rome. There it means a new pope has been elected, but in Grand Prix racing circles it means you have had it in a big way. I got to the bottom of the pits and stopped. Tony Brooks had stopped there too. That was lucky, Tony said. Just as I took the hairpin, my gearbox started to jam. Just as I was telling him, that was nothing to what I had done to my engine. Lewis Evans, who was third, drew up with his front wheel at a drunken angle, having just broken the top right-hand wishbone. The first car to arrive in a reasonably saleable condition was Cliff Allison, who had done a fine job in bringing the Lotus into fourth place. It was all a decidedly shaky do, and I walked back with Tony, congratulating him on his first major Grand Prix win, at an average of 129.93 miles an hour into the bargain. He went off to collect his prize from ex-King Leopold and his wife, and then I was called over. The ex-King of the Belgians is a tremendous enthusiast. He and his wife run a Ferrari themselves, and while I was chatting to him, I told him how hard I had tried to get the lap record. "But you did get it," he said, "on that last lap. I timed it myself." So, of course, I was delighted. It meant an extra point in the championship, but I was more pleased because I had really tried for it.
I think in trying to catch me in the latter stages of the race, made fastest lap. I think he blew the Ferrari up going over the line, in fact, on the very last lap. And it was a race where a lot of people finished up with some sort of problems, and my gearbox wasn't of the best either. I seem to remember that I wasn't able to get all my gears either. So it was an interesting race, but very satisfying race to me, because I consider it one of the driver's circuits. So obviously it's more satisfying to win on a driver's circuit than just one of run-of-the-mill circuits.
This result brought me up in the championship with a bang. I now had 14 against Stirling's 17, and was second, which was very different from my indifferent fourth place with 7 points after Zandvoort, when Stirling was still top with 17. But the fact remained that after 4 World Championship races had been run, Ferrari had still to register a victory.
Must have been 58, the year he won the championship. I went back to I was in the same hotel with them, and Mike had said, "Oh, come up to the room and for a drink or something or another." So I went up there, and Peter Collins was there with his wife, or girlfriend as she was at the time, I think. And I said, Peter was on his own in the room. And I said, "Where's Mike?" And he said, "Oh, he's in the bathroom." So I went into the bathroom, and there was Mike in this full bath of water with all his clothes on, and this girl, and the whole thing was hysterical.
After a good party in Paris on the Tuesday night, I set off for Le Mans on Wednesday with Bernard Caillet, a motoring correspondent for one of the American motoring magazines, in his very much modified Renault Dauphine, at a rate of knots that would have horrified Rodney Walkley. It certainly did me. However, he seemed to have the situation in hand, and after lunch, on the way, Bernard dropped me off at the Hotel de Paris, where I usually stay, and I went off to have a look at the cars. The race had been reinstated this year as a World Sports Car Championship event, but I did not think we stood a very good chance, mainly due to the brakes again, our drums against the discs of the Astons and Jaguars. Our only hope was rain, a hope that was more than amply fulfilled in the event. It was, I think, about this time that Ferrari had made his widely quoted statement, worthy of Mahomet at his best, that fuel injection originated in Germany, disc brakes in England, and neither had yet reached Maranello. However, discs were to do so before the year was out. The race itself and the South Circuit, over which the 24-hour race is run, are too well known to warrant further description here. It is without doubt a tremendous spectacle, and its fairground atmosphere, with cars racing around at high speed in the dark, with headlights blazing and the lighted booths, shooting galleries, dancing halls and eating places, have over the years given the race an importance which is not really justified. But then I speak for the drivers, who consider it as dangerous an event as the early Christians did when they discovered it was real lions they had to play with. The analogy is more apt than it may seem because both events were big attractions from the box office point of view. The scene on the morning of the race is incredible as charter planes and light aircraft queue up to land on the airfield behind the grandstands. And to the British and American motor racing enthusiast, it is as Mecca is to the pilgrim. The Aston Martin team was strongly fancied as the winners, and Thursday evening's training session from 7 p.m. to midnight confirmed this view. Moss did 4 minutes 7.3 seconds, Brooks 4 minutes 8.3, Salvadori 4 minutes 11.1, whereas the best that I could do was 4 minutes 13. The car, the V12 Testarossa 3-litre, the same as we had driven at Nürburgring, lacked the Aston's speed on the straight. About a third of the way along it, I found we could get up to about 160 miles an hour, but above that it simply crept up. The most astonishing time was set up by Cliff Allison, who lapped in 4 minutes 12.7 with a 2-litre Lotus. Once again, Pete and I were to drive together, leaving Phil Hill paired with Jean de Bien and Taffy with Seidel as his mate. At 3:30, the cars were pushed up to their appointed places, and the usual army of gendarmes cleared the pit area. Le Mans must be a paradise for French burglars, because every gendarme in France appears to be on duty at the circuit. With 5 minutes to go, the drivers were lined up in their little painted circles opposite their cars, and that strange, impressive and oppressive silence clamped down over the crowd. Then the swish of the falling flag and the footsteps of the drivers racing to their cars were drowned by the raucous exhausts. Stirling was first away, as he nearly always is, and I was behind the other Astons as well as we went under the Dunlop Bridge. I caught them on the Mulsanne Straight and was second behind Stirling at the end of the first lap, but he had got a good 4 seconds on me. Then Taffy went ahead of me on lap 2, and then Tony as well. I decided it would be best to stay up with the leaders, but not to start anything that would use up the brakes too much. Round about lap 5, I slipped past Tony and Taffy, who were having a scrap and hadn't noticed me. So again I was second, but Stirling was pulling away like mad at the rate of 5 seconds per lap. With 1 hour gone, the Aston had a lead of half a minute ahead of me. Then came Taffy and then Tony. Taffy had a faster car than mine, and he was driving very well. He suddenly went ahead of both of us to lie second for a lap or two. But Tony and I were with him, and Tony kept pulling the Aston alongside us and generally harrying us. A few spots of rain now began to fall, and about this time I went ahead of Taffy again with a lap of 1:21.32, which was to remain the fastest lap, although it did not approach my lap in 1957 with a 4.1 litre Ferrari, when I marked up 125.6 miles an hour. I was very pleased to have got it, as it made my 4th successive fastest lap in the race for 1955, 56, 57 and 58. Then came the big sensation. Stirling blew up in Mulsanne. This left me in the lead, but only for as long as it took to reach the pits, where I was due in to refuel and hand over to Pete. As I did so, the rain really fell, overwhelming the circuit and reducing visibility to almost nil. It was quite fantastic and very dangerous, as mud washed across the road, just where one braked for the Dunlop Bridge. I was extremely thankful that I had taken the first spell as I dived for cover and Pete set out. Refueling stops confused the race order for a while, but when things had settled down, it was Phil Hill in the lead, going magnificently in the frightful conditions. Even when the rain stopped, the circuit remained treacherous, and there was almost a river across the road at Arnage. About 7:30 p.m., Pete came in to have the clutch looked at. The rain came down again, and the 20-minute pit stop was far too short for poor Pete. This dropped us right back, and Hill led from Seidel, with Duncan Hamilton, who loves the rain, right up in 3rd place. Both the Écurie Cos cars were out. They had won in the past 2 years. but the 1958 event had been a tragedy for them, with both cars out within half an hour of the start.
The 1958 Le Mans, the thing I remember most about it was my decision that would be my very last Le Mans. The reason for this was nothing to do with my accident the previous year in 1957. It was just that once again, in the middle of the morning, this fateful 3 or 4 o'clock I think it was, I think the race had been wet virtually the whole of the event to that point. And I'd run out of underclothing and socks, and I really came to my turn about 3 o'clock in the morning, and I found that all my stuff, I couldn't dry any of my stuff, so I had to put on wet underpants, you know, wet vest, wet socks, and get into a motor car at 3 o'clock in the morning. And I said, if you ever do this motor race again, you need your head examining. And I never did. And I drove for Ferrari in 1959 on the strict understanding that I wouldn't have to race at Le Mans.
I took over from Pete again about 10 at night and set off unhappily into the rain and the dark. We were about 6 laps behind the leaders, Phil and then Ivor, who had taken over from Duncan's detail. Meanwhile, the clutch continued to give trouble, due, I regret to say, to my getaway at the start. I slipped it because I could not hear the engine note in the racket at the start. I smelled burning, so I quickly let it in, but obviously it must have been damaged as it began to slip more and more as the night wore on. By midnight, Duncan and Ivor were in the lead, and at about midnight, I handed over to Peter again, by which time we were lying 9th. The Hill Gendebien car was back in the lead by 2:15 a.m. when Peter finally came to a stop out on the circuit. The clutch had finally given way, and Pete came back to the pits on foot. It would be hypocritical to say I was sorry that we were out. The conditions were so bad that both of us were relieved that we had had it. We just drove back to the hotel, had a couple of drinks, and went to bed, unlike the hardy enthusiasts who were still huddled in the grandstands, determined not to miss a thing. Their enthusiasm put us to shame. In the morning, we drove up to Paris and caught the train back to England, and Peter and Louise came down to Farnham with me to stay the night in the French and Ponds Hotel. We actually heard the results of the race at my garage in Farnham. At the hotel, they were quite shattered to see us and could hardly believe their eyes. The race itself more or less clinched the sports car championship for Ferrari, and Hill and Gendebien had driven a great race under almost impossible conditions. As a wet weather car, the Ferrari was not as good as the Jag, and it was bad luck on Duncan and Ivor that the former crashed in the closing hours of the race. It was, I think, the speed differential that caused its crash. A little French car running in front of him ran into a cloudburst just after Arnage, which obscured the driver's vision completely, causing him to brake almost to a standstill. Duncan came along, then swerved to avoid it, got a wheel onto the grass and spun. The Jaguar went end over end, only Duncan doesn't call it end over end. Duncan was taken off to hospital with bruises all over him, and that is a lot of bruises because there's a lot of Duncan. Many amusing stories are told of his stay in hospital, but I like best the one that describes Duncan's agony, lying in bed watching all the 10,000 franc notes of his second prize floating out of the window one after the other. This upset him much more than his physical injuries. Another great performance was that of Peter and Graham Whitehead, who brought their privately owned and outdated Aston Martin into second place behind the Ferrari. Peter had won Le Mans in 1951 in a Jaguar with his friend Peter Walker, which gave this country their first win at Le Mans for 16 years. Motor racing lost another great driver and sportsman when the two Whiteheads crashed in the Tour de France later in the year, and the quiet and charming Peter lost his life. After literally a flying visit to England, I was back in Paris again en route for Reims and the French Grand Prix, the next round in the World Championship. The high-speed circuit suited the Ferrari, and I won the race, but the joy was taken away because of the fatal accident to Luigi Musso. It was a tragedy, and particularly so for Italy, as Musso was the last remaining Italian driver of Grand Prix caliber. Afterwards, Enzo Ferrari said, "I have won at Reims, but the price is too high. I have lost the only Italian driver who mattered in Formula One racing." I never knew him well, although he was a most likable person, but he was too conscious of the fact that he was the only Italian driver of note. It made him try too hard. He felt that he must press on for the sake of national honor. Italian prestige was at stake, he felt, and consequently he tried that much harder. I had gained 3 points more than Stirling by my win, and this brought us level with 23 points each. The next round was the British Grand Prix at Silverstone.
A race at Silverstone when I was third in the British Grand Prix, and this was with the 2-litre Cooper, really a Formula 2 car with a slightly larger engine. And I remember going extremely well and beating the Van Wall for third position behind Hawthorn.
To everyone's joy, Pete turned round to win the British Grand Prix at an average of 102 miles an hour. I came in just 24 seconds behind him, with Salvadori third. It gave me 7 points lead over Stirling, and it brought Pete up to 14, which meant he was in a position to challenge Stirling for second place. Tragically, only 3 weeks later, Pete was to lose his life at the Nürburgring. Tony was leading the race, and I was behind Pete as we went into the little dip, which is the Pflanzgarten. As Pete accelerated out of it, he seemed to me to be going a little too fast. Peter was fighting hard to catch Tony, and as he put his foot right down, and in the heat of the moment, he did not turn into the corner early enough. When he did turn, it was obvious that he was going too wide. He was only a yard, maybe 2 yards out of line, but it was enough. He went round the corner perfectly normally, but running wide, and the car slid, drifting out. His back wheel hit the bank, and the car lifted, and then, without the slightest warning, fantastically quickly, his car just whipped straight over. My clutch packed up just after the pits next time round. I knew I had had my race. There was no drive in the car at all. Meantime, the race went on, with Tony winning, but my mind was not on it. Stirling broke Fangio's lap record and got the point for the fastest lap before going out with a dead magneto. The next round was in Portugal, and Stirling won with me second. I finished with no breaks at all, but I did get fastest lap. From there, we went to Monza for the Italian race. By lap 50, with 20 to go, Tony was 10 seconds behind me. Each lap, he carved a little off this slender lead, and I saw my championship title slipping out of my grasp. On lap 59, my lead was 2 seconds, and I could almost feel Tony breathing down my neck. Then, on lap 60, with only 10 more to do, Tony took me right in front of the grandstands. I was bitterly disappointed, but I had only myself to blame. Now I began to wonder if I could even finish, as with each lap the slip became worse. Slower and slower I went as the last few laps came up, and Phil was catching me up now. By the last lap, the car was hardly moving, and as I took the south curve for the last time, I saw him in my mirror coming up fast. God, I thought, perhaps he doesn't realize it's me. So I put my arm out and frantically waved him down. Afterwards, he told me that he didn't realize that it was me until he saw the green sleeve of my jacket come out and wave at him. It was a sporting gesture on his part to slow down, and he had given me wonderful support, making fastest lap into the bargain, which was a terrific performance in his first drive in a Grand Prix Ferrari. Indeed, if he had not had a tread go early in the race, I think there is little doubt that he would have won the race, although this is not to decry in any way the magnificent show that Tony put up. Thanks to his win, his teammate, Stirling, still had a chance of snatching the championship. although the 6 points I had scored were not going to make it any easier. The various permutations and possibilities were set out by Rodney Walkley in his column in the Motor on September 24th. Everyone, we suppose, is agog, if you know what we mean, to see which of two Englishmen will be hailed 1958 world champion after the Grand Prix of Morocco, Casablanca, October 19. A thing in itself without precedent. Mike Hawthorn goes to the circuit with 40 marks, gained in his 6 best races so far. Stirling Moss, who won none at Monza, has 32. If our calculations are correct, Moss must win at Casablanca to be in the picture and add fastest lap to make 41 points. If Mike wins, he will have 44 points, 45 with fastest lap, because although he would gain 8 points for a win, he would drop 4, third place in the Argentine Grand Prix, which will become the most inferior performance out of the 6 best. Second place will give him 42, third place 40, and Stirling must win to equal that and make the fastest lap to beat it. If Mike were to finish anywhere below second or retire, even with fastest lap in his pocket, his marks would remain at 40.
Casablanca was a very fast, again, demanding circuit, and I seem to remember I really was on quite good form, and I did happen to be leading. I was winning the race. I did manage to get fastest lap. Mike wasn't second. He was third. Phil Hill, I think, was second. And the other 2 Van Wals having gone out. And he did the correct thing. He backed off and let Mike come second, which was very frustrating, but I must say I think it was the correct thing to do. After all, he was a Ferrari driver, and it was more important to him, or to Ferrari, that obviously that Mike should win the title than myself. So I lost the title by, I think, half a point or a point.
Sterling, I think, was extremely unlucky because the 1958 point system was rather ridiculous in that if you bear in mind that Stirling had won 3 Grand Prix with Van Wall, he'd won 1 Grand Prix with Rob Walker's Cooper in the Argentine, so he had 4 Grand Prix to Mike's 1 Grand Prix, and even I had 3 Grand Prix. You know, there really is something wrong with the point system when the world champion wins on that sort of basis, because in my book, the world champion is the guy who wins the most Grand Prix. Because the difference between winning and second and third and fourth is you know, the difference between chalk and cheese. But having said all that, I mean, Mike drove according to the rules and the point system at that time, however crazy we may have thought it was, and therefore all credit to Mike for being the first world champion, because it's always more difficult to be the first to do something, and you know, he did it, so, you know, marvellous.
I was going to my garage, which was in Dorking. It was a dreadful day in January, pouring with rain, and I'd gone over the Hog's Back, and I'd just dropped down, and I was in the 300 SL, and I saw a Jaguar come up behind me, and I wasn't used to Jaguars coming up behind me. In fact, I thought it was rather an impertinence. And when we came down from the Hog's Back onto the dual carriageway of the Guildford bypass, the Jaguar came alongside, and I saw it was Mike Hawthorn, and he waved to me, and we both accelerated as hard as we could alongside each other down the dual carriageway, and we were going quickish by then. I lifted off and I dropped about a car's length behind him, and as he went through the bend, the car broke away about 5 degrees, and I thought, oh, this is just Mike in his usual form, and then suddenly it completely spun round and faced me, and we went down the road. By this time I was braking as hard as I could. I could hear that he was still absolutely flat out, although it was going backwards. And he crossed the dual carriageway. There was a lorry coming up the other way, which he missed. In fact, he hit a bollard as he crossed it, and it knocked his bumper off, and I ran over the bumper. And then he went right across, just missed the lorry, went into the grass the other side, and a lot of spume and mud flew up, and I managed to stop opposite on the other side of the dual carriageway, and I ran over the road thinking to go up to him and say, that was a bloody silly thing to do, Mike, And I looked in the car, and he wasn't in the driving seat. And then I walked round the car, and I saw him lying in the back, full length in the back seat, just as if he was got in the back seat to have a ziz, and his eyes were open, and I saw a trickle of blood coming from the back of it, and as I looked down at him, his eyes suddenly glazed, and I realized that he'd gone.